So welcome to CHC. My name is Cindy Lopez, and I'm the Director of Community Connections here at CHC. And Community Connections just means you're experiencing part of it tonight, community education and community engagement. So thank you for coming tonight and welcome. How many of you have been to a parent ed or teacher ed or community education session here at CHC before? Great, most of you, awesome. So welcome back. Thank you for coming. And I know it's tempting to probably just go sit out and enjoy the evening tonight. It's such a beautiful day, especially after last week's weather. So thank you for coming. I just want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about CHC and give you a little bit of information. Since many of you have been here before for our parent education or teacher ed, you probably know a lot already. But also, just FYI, tonight one of our screens is not working. So all the slides are up here, but you also have the slides in a handout on your chair. So CHC has been a part of our community for 65 years now. So we're really proud about that. Nonprofit and helping kids and teens and young adults. So, and what do we want? We want kids and teens to experience all these great things, have all these great outcomes. So we want to support them in meaningful ways that get them to develop grit and resilience, to help them have a brighter future, for them to be able to make friends, for them to realize their dreams. So those are all the kinds of things. That's kind of why we do what we do. So we believe in the promise and potential of every child, teen, and young adult, and our mission is to help remove barriers. So barriers especially regarding language, location, and ability to pay. So we have more and more of our clinicians who are Spanish speaking, so we're able to serve a larger population because of that. So breaking down those barriers for language. Also, breaking down barriers, location. So we actually have a group of people who are in East Palo Alto and work in Ravenswood. On the ground over there, they do evaluations and assessments and also provide parent and teacher education to our partners in East Palo Alto. We also have a satellite campus in South San Jose as of this year. So one of our schools, EBC School, has a satellite campus there, and we also have some of our clinicians there who see families. And then lastly, ability to pay. So we're trying to make sure that our services and our resources are available to people who need them. So within our clinic, we have a sliding scale, and we also serve, we have the Medi-Cal contract for Santa Clara County that we also serve families on Medi-Cal in South San Jose. We are really interested in looking at the whole child, not just their specific anxiety, whatever issue it is, anxiety or dyslexia. We're looking at the whole child. So we want to understand academic skills. We want to help them understand how to learn. We want to look at their physical development and their mental health and wellness. And our areas of excellence are ADHD, learning differences such as dyslexia, and anxiety, depression, and autism. We have 4 divisions. Clinical services, so those are folks made up of child psychiatrists, psychologists, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists. We have our community connections group, which is part of what you're experiencing here tonight. Sandhill School and Esther B. Clark School, so 2 schools, and this presentation tonight is actually part of our Sandhill School series as it aligns with the kids that we serve at Sandhill School. So reading disorder, ADHD, anxiety, all those kinds of kids we serve at Sandhill. And Esther B. Clark is a non-public school whose students are experience more emotional and behavioral challenges. And they are districts actually contract to send their kids there. So lastly, a little commercial for EdRev. How many of you are familiar with EdRev? A few, okay. So here's my commercial. So EdRev Expo, so it's our 10th anniversary this past summer, we Penn, Parents Education Network, which is based in San Francisco, became part of CHC, so all of its programs became part of CHC. So one of their main programs is EdRev, so it's now a CHC program. We're excited to say that it's all free this year, so you can register online, come with your family, spend the day. There are workshop sessions, and actually Dr. Hendren will be speaking again at EdRev. And there's also fun things for kids to do. They can play, it's at AT&T Park, so they can get out on the field, they can use a pop fly machine, run the bases, climbing walls, yoga, all kinds of things. So check that out if you haven't already. The website is edrevsf.org. So all of that behind us now. I wanted to take a few minutes to just introduce Dr. Hendren. We're really thrilled that he's here tonight, and I have notes because he has a long list of accomplishments. So he is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and co-director of the UCSF Dyslexia Center. He's also past president of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He's published over 100 scientific papers and 5 books. He's busy. And it's been listed in the best doctors in America each year since it was published, first in 1996. So we're thrilled that he's here tonight to share his expertise with us, especially around this area, that the intersection of ADHD, reading disorders, and anxiety, because we know that they kind of are all tied together, and obviously you probably know that since you're here tonight. So thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. Thanks. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Working? Great. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the second time I've been, so I think that's usually a good sign when you're someplace and they ask you to come back. So it's a good place and a nice place to be part of. You have all the slides in front of you, but I'll go through them, and I'll go through some of them fairly quickly, because some of them you may want more information or you may already know that. So we can come back. I'm going to try to finish a little before 8, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion that comes at the end. And if I'm not making sense as we go through this, or if you feel like you need something for clarification, then stop me and let's clarify it. But if it's a big discussion, let's save that for the end. So when we talk at medical meetings, we always have to say, who do we get funding from? And I do different trials, and I'm on different advisory boards. I'm not going to talk very much about any of those, but it is where some of my funding comes from. What I would like to talk about tonight is to give an overview of dyslexia and emotional disorders in the beginning, talk a bit about how those intersect with anxiety and ADHD. There'll be some of the things that I talk about that sound like that's mild and that's familiar, and there'll be some of those that you say, oh, that doesn't sound very good. And so there's a whole gamut of outcomes, but we'll talk about, at the end, things that we might do more for interventions and treatments. In the middle, too, we'll talk more about a few other comorbidities, and I'll tell you a little about our Dyslexia Center and the research that we're doing there and what we're feeling excited about. We have a paper that was just published today on comorbidity, recognizing psychiatric comorbidities with reading disorders. It was published in Frontiers in Psychiatry, and if you just even Google that, you could find the paper. It's an open access paper, and you can download the PDF if you're interested. But the premise of the paper is in these 3 points that I give. The first, that reading disorders are specific disorders of specific learning disorders. They're common in the general population, but they're often overlooked. So often people in the mental health field don't think about a learning disorder or a reading disorder when they're thinking about someone struggling with different kinds of issues or problems that's making their life more difficult. But it works the other way too, that often in a school setting or an education setting, people are thinking about the learning disorder issue, but they're not thinking about comorbidities like ADHD or anxiety disorders, and they get overlooked. So one of our missions at the Dyslexia Center, but the mission in this paper as well, is to try and bring education to each group so that people begin to think about how could we do an intervention that looks at both things so that we can get the very best kinds of outcomes. When we look at learning disorders and think about their commonality, or how many there are, there's 30 to 50% of the population has a learning disability. That is thought of as, by some as high, but if we're talking about a kind of spread that might be there, at least at some point in life, it could be that high. 27% of them drop out of high school, and about 1/3 of children with learning disabilities have ADHD, and we'll talk more about that as we move forward. So if you think about dyslexia as being initially defined as a phonological difference, that you have trouble getting the pieces of words that make it up, and that defined dyslexia, increasingly we're saying, no, there are other things that are part of dyslexia. It's not just phonics. And it has things like auditory processing, how are you sorting out those sounds, or things like visual discrimination. Can you see the words? Can you see the way things are written? What about the executive function? How well are you paying attention and looking at what's going on? And then sensory motor and the way that gets integrated. And all that comes together to make what is involved in reading and writing. But as we keep going around that circle, there are issues with all of those things that relate to how we are processing things socio-emotionally, how we're doing in things like math and other kinds of learning difficulties, and then things like auditory processing disorder or nonverbal learning disorders, depression and anxiety, ADHD, and others. And in the paper that I mentioned, we try and take those apart and talk about, I think these are hard for you to read here, but you can see them on your handout, that talk about in something, say, like depression, how might impairments in emotional processing affect depression. So in one way, when we look at depression and reading disorders, people will say, well, the kid doesn't know how to read and he gets depressed. But increasingly, people are finding, at least with anxiety, that we can see evidence of that at the very beginning before they're learning how to read. And then those get intertwined and affect the outcomes as they go along. And the things like conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, how much might that relate to ADHD or untreated or poorly treated ADHD that could be doing better? So when we talk about mental disorders and dyslexia or reading disorders, and I'll use those two somewhat interchangeably. There's some controversy in the field about whether dyslexia should be used only for phonological processing disorders, and reading could be all the other things that we went through in that diagram. But it seems dyslexia has become such an accepted term that people think of that now and use the two somewhat interchangeably. But in DSM-5, when people were arguing about classification, there was a lot of fighting about whether it would be dyslexia or reading disorders, and in the end they did reading disorders. So poor readers suffer from things like more depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. Sadly, they're more associated with suicides, with learning differences, aggressive and delinquent behaviors, 200% more likely to be arrested. 36% of those with LD, mostly poor readers, received counseling or psychotherapy for low self-esteem, social isolation, and others. So we can see there was a time that I worked in a juvenile justice facility, and it seemed to me that well over 50% of the kids that were there were kids that had learning problems, often reading problems, that left them feeling peripheralized in school, not fully accepted by their peers, not feeling as good as they might, and then as they get more and more peripheralized, they manage to get themselves into groups that are not good for how they're doing. When we look at even just things like anxiety and depression, a study that one of our researchers at the Dyslexia Center, Fumiko Hafe, did, looked at things like anxiety, comparing them to kids with LD and controls. And you can see here the number of kids in each group, that clearly the higher anxiety in kids with learning disorders, higher depression, a lower sense of mastery, and a lower growth mindset, a kind of positive attitude that says if I work hard, I'll move along, or I can make this work if I just try hard enough. And kids with LD were less likely to have that kind of growth mindset. So when we think about anxiety, we think that people with dyslexia may experience anxiety because they worry that they'll make a mistake or they'll be ridiculed in front of others. And if any of you have a loved one or someone that you know well, you can see, especially in early grades where they're going to be called on to stand up in front of the class and read, and not everybody knows they have a difficult time with them. That's terrifying. They may get stressed out, they may refuse to go to school, they may find other ways to avoid that. But you have to have a right amount of anxiety. If you have too little anxiety and you totally avoid something, you're not motivated enough to do something. If you have way too much anxiety, then that doesn't work so well either. And finding the right amount is the key. And it builds the more we feel about our control, and ultimately can lead to freezing, that if somebody is feeling anxious, and I think we all know that feeling, when it just gets so high, then you can't perform as well. The anticipation of failure then can raise anxiety. Frustration can lead to anger, which may be targeted at teachers and at sometimes parents. Often parents can be likely targets of that buildup that's happened all day long for a kid of not feeling like they're doing as well. And they come home and the tension is beginning to drain, but they're beginning to relax, and then parents get blamed or things get not going so well, and that leads to even more stress. All of that leads to problems with self-esteem and negative thoughts, and that can lead into depression. And all of this leads into family stress for parents and SIBs, and how can we help make that go better. The increased internalizing anxious and depressed symptomatology in dyslexia is something that we see, and the severity depends on the comorbidity of other things like ADHD, perceived social support, and often female gender, who have a greater difficulty with this than males. Males may be more acting out rather than internalizing. So compared to college students without reading disorders, up to 5 times as many report clinical significant things like test anxiety, and their general anxiety is higher too. And sometimes parents have a similar kind of anxiety that can be there, whether that's because they're worried about their kids or because they have a baseline in themselves kind of anxiety. Those two things can begin to interact with each other and create additional anxiety for both the parents and the child. What it looks like, it can look like being hypervigilant, paying very attention, very nervous, worried. I don't want to go to that party, or if they go to the party, they're kind of feeling uncomfortable. I don't want to go to school. I don't want to have to read in front of others. They can be very reactive to novel stimuli where they don't feel like they know what's going to be coming next. What does that mean? How might they handle it? They cope by avoidance, as I'd mentioned. Often parents, in well-meaning ways, will say, oh, let me help you get out of this. Let me protect you. Let me take those things away. And I think that's well-intentioned, but the best part of what they might be able to do is work with the teachers and work with the child and the teachers to try and create a more welcoming, open environment that helps them do better there. There can be physical symptoms as a way, like headaches, stomach aches, the way avoiding going to school, inattention and poor performance at school, and it becomes most noticeable at about 6 to 12 years of age, and yet continues on as a fairly high prevalence of 14 to 27% as people go on through life, with a fair amount of notable anxiety. Other symptoms are problems with emotional processing, which may be impaired, explosive outbursts, easily overwhelmed, extremely sensitive, readily tearful, fears and or preoccupations with things like about death and dying, and avoidance of outside and interpersonal activities like we had mentioned already. There was a study done by part of our group at UCSF that has been doing what we call a phenotyping project that I'll tell you more about later, that has imaging, some computer-based ways of studying things, and one part of that in kids with dyslexia was done by Virginia Strum and looked at how kids looking at emotional movies or emotional pictures, what happened to their galvanic skin response, to their hand temperature, to the muscle tension in their heads, other things like that that were reflective of a neurobiologic basis for anxiety. And for kids with dyslexia, they had a higher amount of that than kids without dyslexia. Their autonomic system, the way their nervous system worked, was more tuned to be emotionally reactive. We can talk about whether that's something that is just part of their being, the way they've been their whole life, or whether it's something that gets added to by things that happen as they are dealing with the dyslexia or with the reading difficulties. And another study done by Fumiko Haeft, who I'd mentioned before, that's in our research group, looked at what's called anxiety and attentional bias, where attentional bias, one way is to have this hypervigilance, difficulty disengaging, but the other side of that is to attention away from a task. So she did what's called a dot probe test, where you look at different pictures that bring up different feelings and different ways of viewing things, and then looks at how anxious they get or what they do when they're looking at it. And she had three kind of things. One might be words that have things like physical threat, like bomb, war, social or stereotype threats, things like dumb, disabled, or slow, an academic threat that would have words like book, read, and write, and then would measure their anxiety when they saw these words and what they did with them. And the kids with physical, both groups, controls, typically developing kids, or kids with, in this case, LD, there was no difference in how they reacted anxiety-wise to physical threat. There was no difference in how they reacted to social stereotype threats. But when they heard words that had to do with reading, like book, read, or write, there was a big difference, a statistical difference between the two of them. So kids began to get programmed even to start to feel anxious when they're starting to think they have to do something that relates to this kind of activity that involves reading or writing or those things that they haven't been able to do well. And there was a significant difference between those two groups. So then tools to cope with academic struggles may be really important for addressing this attentional bias or anxiety, and we'll talk more about some of those in the middle third of the talk. The course of anxiety, 20% of kids with dyslexia also have anxiety, and then another 20% go on to develop depression. Childhood onset of anxiety has a high risk of progressing to depression, and these intense symptoms may diminish, but they often continue throughout one's lifetime. The emotional symptoms may go both ways. They may, the learning and the difficulty learning or with reading makes their anxiety goes up, but the anxiety makes them not perform as well, and so it becomes a kind of cycle or a downward spiral. The symptoms and failure in these major roles may come in adulthood for some, even as some kids that are very bright and are doing very well finally start to get to places where their challenges are great enough that then they do start to have problems, and then those symptoms of anxiety come out and are more difficult. There are 6 kinds of anxiety disorders that we think of in psychiatry. The one that's most common for reading disorders are the generalized anxiety disorder, but it also includes separation anxiety disorder, kids that have a hard time separating from their primary caregiver, social anxiety disorder, worried about being or feeling anxious in social settings, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and panic disorder. When you think about how do you know if your child has significant anxiety, There are some scales that you can find. You don't necessarily have to put them through a test, but you and your spouse might look at these together and say, well, what do we think? How does that measure up? And this one called the SCARED is available online. If you go to the University of Pittsburgh, you'll see that they'll give you that test without having to purchase it, which you have to do for either of these others. And we use these more for research. But the SCARED is available and you can use it. Not that it's going to make a firm diagnosis, but it's going to let you know, are these things that I might see clustering together for how my child is going and doing that would make me think their anxiety might be significant. So moving from anxiety to ADHD, am I making sense so far? And am I going too fast or too slow? Is the pace okay? Okay, good. So then we'll go on and start talking a bit more about ADHD. So learning disorders, as we'd mentioned, are often overlooked and undertreated in children, especially some of those with ADHD, and yet there's a lot of overlap between reading disorders and ADHD. Genetic overlap, it's not uncommon to see kids with both, but to see parents who have both, and to see even multiple generations where the two go together. 15 to 45% of children with ADHD also have RD, and the most common kind of ADHD for reading disorder is the inattentive type. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you might recall that there is an impulsive type, an inattentive type, and a combined type of those two being put together. But the most common one is the more inattentive type. And the thing that's hard about that is that these kids aren't so impulsive, so then they're not getting in trouble all the time, and then they're not getting noticed as having ADHD. And girls are much more likely to have inattentive ADHD, so they often sit quietly spaced out in class, and the teacher overlooks them because they're not causing trouble. And so there's also some common cognitive deficits in processing speed, which is another way of suggesting some common genes going between them. But there are things to love about ADHD, and if you know somebody that has it, or even if you have it yourself, there'll be things you like and things you don't like. But the things, there used to be, and still is, I guess, an idea that part of our way of survival was based on having either a scanning focus, a hunter kind of person, or being more of a farmer, agrarian that stayed focused. And if you were a hunter and you were thin and you had to get your food fast and you ate it and then you moved, then that scanning focus was good. You look out over the field and you could see what was going on, but if you had a scanning focus and you were a farmer, it didn't work so well. So there are advantages to each. We do evals for NFL football players, a psychologist and I do, and it's been interesting because they need to have this eval in order to be able to use stimulant medications when they're playing for an NFL team. And when they come in, it's been interesting to hear them talk about when the medication is the most helpful to them. Some of them say they really like to use the medication when they're learning plays, when they're at practice, but when they're on the field during the game, they like the scanning focus that they have from ADHD. Others, though, it depends on what position they're playing, say, that's not so good for me. I want to be able to focus on the ball and what I'm doing, and so I want to keep my focus there. But I appreciated this one running back that said he had to keep his eyes looking all the time, and he needed to learn the plays, but at the game day, he decided that he'd take a lower dose of the ADHD medication when he was using it. There's also a way that people with ADHD can learn to hyper-focus. It's as though they get into a state and they can screen everything out and they do well. And when you listen to particularly young people, but some successful folks that have ADHD talk about how they do that, they say it's a way that they've learned and practiced to get this hyper ability to screen things out and pay attention. There's a way having ADHD, if you're inattentive and you're shifting focuses and you have trouble staying focused, you learn to be resilient, you learn to be committed if you're going to keep moving ahead well. Yet there's a certain ingenuity that comes with that as well, a willing to take risks and spontaneity. They can be funny. Anything is possible. They're persistent. They bring a different perspective because of that quick thinking and way of moving through things. And they can often be very motivational. The hyperfocus is not something that I find that people with ADHD get too easily. They work very hard and they find the right place. They go to this place where they're studying, and then sometimes they do it by turning on the TV, the radio, a whole bunch of things. So there's so many things they have to do that. Other times, though, they do it by finding a very quiet booth, a place, and that's more often, where then they can get themselves into that hyper-focused state. But on the football field, or, you know, I've heard some skiers, too, saying that they do better with a scanning focus. I think more if they're doing slalom or doing more downhill. And for slalom, they need to be focused on those gates coming up fast. There are some really good motivational speakers that have ADHD. When you listen to them, they're funny. They have a great way of doing things. And well, this isn't the perfect example, but if some of you heard Gavin Newsom talk, he's somebody with dyslexia and ADHD, and a number of other people like that, tell great stories, are moving, have a way, but they scan the audience and they know where people are, and they have a way of really relating well to the people. There are famous people with ADHD, Albert Einstein, Michael Phelps. There are some you may not care as much for, like Paris Hilton, and Richard Branson, a variety of others have ADHD, and many of those people also have dyslexia or reading disorders. As I alluded to earlier, there's this inattention, a distractible inattention, and then impulsivity and hyperactivity, and then you can be predominantly inattentive combined or predominantly hyperactive and impulsive. But the distractible inattention is what's so important in defining this. Sometimes I also see kids that have autism, and sometimes parents will come in wondering about one or the other, and they'll say, I think my kid has ADHD. And I'd say, really, why is that? And say, well, because he's in the other room watching television, and I call him to come to dinner, and he won't pay any attention to me. And I keep hollering and hollering, and he still doesn't pay attention. And finally, I go and grab him by the chin, pull his head up, and say, it's time to come to dinner, come in and eat. And he shakes himself and comes in and eats. Well, that's not ADHD. That's not distractible inattention. The kid with distractible inattention is one who hears the call at first, gets up, but then sees a friend out the window and looks at that, and then remembers there's something on his iPad that he needed to look at, and then he does that, and then he forgot that he was called to dinner, so he goes back and watches TV again. And then keeping those tasks in mind is just too hard. So it's the distractible inattention that's the hallmark, rather than the difficulty shifting sets kind of inattention, where you have a hard time moving from one thing to the next. There can be ways that ADHD affects throughout the life cycle. So for children, it's academic kinds of things and relationships. It can begin to affect their self-esteem. But in adolescence, there get to be more injuries, can also sometimes lead into substance abuse, especially if it's poorly treated. There are more motor vehicle accidents if you have ADHD. Studies that have looked at people that get into wrecks in a car. There are more of them that have ADHD. And then they can begin to have legal and occupational difficulties, and that can then go throughout a life cycle, and we're increasingly treating ADHD into adulthood. The outcome statistics would say that about a third of people outgrow the need for specific treatment for ADHD, often because they go to jobs that allow them to have that shifting focus, to move a focus around. So one example people often give is, like, say, being a lineman, or doing things that allow that kind of shifting focus. But if you stay in a classroom, then that's often a difficult time. Some of the medical students that I treat will take the medication while they're in the first 2 years and are having to take tests, but when they get out on the wards, they find that their shifting scanning focus works as much, so they don't need to keep taking the medication in the same way. But about a third of people figure out how to do that. A third continue to have some difficulties and need some of the medication, and then a third have greater difficulties, maybe when they get into comorbid disorders like substance abuse and other things that isn't necessarily caused by the ADHD, but might be caused by it going unrecognized or going undertreated. The way you can get to online measures as well for that, if you say, I wonder, what symptoms does he have of ADHD? What could I use to do that? The Vanderbilt, you can just Google and you can pull that up, and there's one for teachers and there's one for parents. So you can fill it out, and you don't have to, sit down and look at the kid or ask them to fill it out. It's more like you and a teacher or you and somebody can think about it together. The Connors you have to buy, and the ADHD rating scale with some searching you can often find for some study sites. It's not meant to be reproduced, but you can get to it to have another way of assessing what's happening. So when you think about anxiety disorder treatment, there's some of these that'll all relate to this CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy type approach. But you work at positive reframing. Your kid comes home and he's so discouraged, and he talks about how bad things went today and talks about a bunch of assumptions that they've made about why that happens. And you say, is there another way that you could see that? And at first, until they know your game, they say, no, that's the way it was. You say, well, wouldn't it be possible that maybe this was happening? They say that at school, their best friend, who they had just been talking bad about to another friend, walked by and didn't speak to them. And I know that that person knows that I said something bad about them, and they don't like me, and I've lost that friendship, and it's really bad. And you can see how you do that in your own life in a variety of ways. But you begin to challenge your thoughts. You say, is that thought an assumption, or is that thought something that I could really base things on? And then could I reframe that? Could I say it differently? Could I lead to another way of doing things? So I think sometimes as parents we're likely to say, no, don't think that way, or no, you're not right. But what we're trying to do is help them to challenge their thoughts and go through getting some kind of control through competence, through thinking, I can reframe this in a way that sounds better. So there's a part of psychoeducation, assessment in the formal way of going through CBT. There's a functional assessment of what are those assumptions that you're making. You kind of get exposed to the treatment. There's a way that families can be involved in doing CBT2 as well, so that everybody doesn't get caught into those assumptions that lead to anxiety and depression. And at times then parents could be useful as a coach. It doesn't necessarily have to be seeing a therapist. Another way of going through this is a model that you can see online that's called the de-stress model, that talks about defining it. So with anxiety, and maybe all of it, there's times when I just feel anxious. Well, what's happened? What happened before? What do you think led you to start to feel anxious about that? And then there's some educating about why you suppose you felt anxious about that. Do you think that's the reason or where you have to be? You can speculate about what the feelings were. Then you can begin to teach about other responses that you could put. And then you can begin to pair some of those anxious responses with things like exercise. And often for kids that are very anxious in class, and we'll talk about some classroom interventions, it can be helpful for teachers to be able to give them a break, to say, why don't you go outside and walk around for a minute? Why don't you do some other activity? And for you, if you're sensing that stuff. And that then you can also begin to see success, note success, praise success, and then begin to strategize for future encounters, times where the child says, oh, I'm so nervous about doing this, and then you kind of take them through this step. What is it that makes you nervous? How might you work out another strategy to work on that? And go through doing that with them on a number of occasions. There are other things too, like yoga, mindfulness, meditation, biofeedback, and exercise. We'll talk a little bit at the end about biofeedback. The final verdict isn't in on whether biofeedback helps with ADHD or helps with reading disorders or helps with anxiety, but there's an increasing number of sophisticated studies that are suggesting with some amount of practice, it can make a difference. It often takes a number of sessions and a fair amount of money, but it's increasingly finding its place. And exercise is important. So things that you can think about discussing with the teachers or with even your own strategies at home. There are ways, and I think this is hard to read, but hopefully you can read it on your handout, that examples of kind of behavioral interventions would be things like the student will practice appropriate verbal exchanges. So if the kid's impulsive and blurts these things out and says them too fast, then the teacher, rather than being critical, can say, how could you have said that to me differently? And if a kid comes in and he's feeling really impulsive and kind of does that to you, then rather than don't talk to me that way, it's, is there a way that you could tell me that? Let's practice it. Let's see how you could tell me that wouldn't make me so angered in what you're saying. You can remove the student from the situation until control is achieved, and that way, why don't you go out and walk around? Why don't we go do something else for a minute and get you distracted from this thing that you're focused on? There's also a way of thinking about seating, and I think increasingly teachers are being sensitive to this, but sometimes they put the kid with the worst attention problems in the back of the class where they could have the worst attention problems, and trying to move that thing and work with teachers. Establish and model and rehearse classroom rules. Parents might even help kids with that as well, but in a class that's disruptive, teachers can do that. Remove frustrating stimuli, teach ways to deal with frustration, take a deep breath, go out and walk around, say, I need a break, could you give me a minute? Teaching thinking before action, teaching perspective taking. How do you think that other person felt? Well, no, isn't that how you were going to say? Do you really know how they're feeling? What do you think they felt when you said that? Provide immediate social reinforcement. Tell them quickly how well they were doing rather than waiting too long. And then limit consequences. Sometimes parents say, that's it, you're grounded for a month. And that usually doesn't work real well. Kids don't think in terms of months. So you have to find some way of saying, what's a meaningful grounding? And they say, I don't care, go ahead and ground me for a month. But if you say, you lose your TV privileges for the next, or computer privileges for the next hour, and that's something that you can reinforce and not give up on. These groundeds for months never last for a month, and they know that. So you need to give one that's a consequence that's really going to work. There are also ways of modifying and accommodating. Often kids benefit from extended time for the assignments that they're doing. Most teachers now want a note from a doctor to say that, but if you're trying to get that note from your primary care physician, or sometimes even your psychiatrist, they may not have that in their repertoire in the same way. So I find when I give this talk and use this slide for even talks with psychiatrists, they're writing these down like, oh, I'm going to use this in my summary of my report. And sometimes you can help them by giving them some of these things as well, saying, here are some ways that I think we could help my daughter or my son reduce the volume of assignments, break long assignments into smaller chunks, not give them a great big thing that they have to pay attention to, but say, okay, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. Allow breaks to recharge, extend time for test taking or breakup, provide safety study outlines, speak in short, simple, positively phrased sentences, and rephrase this response. Now, I'll bet all of these things are things that are done here at Sandhill School. And we have had a collaboration with Armstrong School, and I'm pretty sure they mostly do that, but I do find when we go in and do our phenotyping study that I'll tell you about in a few minutes, they're often reminded, oh yeah, he would really understand these things better if they were broken into chunks rather than my giving them this big assignment and placing them in front of them. So I think there are always good things for all of us to be reminded of. When we think about pharmacologic treatment, it's important to think sometimes medications can be helpful. And I do find sometimes people are either too quick to think medications are going to solve everything and I don't have to do anything else, or people are too quick to say, I don't want to use anything but the medications. You know, it's kind of like that's the worst thing that I could possibly think of. And yet medications can make a really big difference, and they can make a difference in the reciprocal interactions. So it's not just the meds. It's like if you're impulsive and inattentive, the world reacts to you in a certain way that makes things not cycle as well. But it's important to think about a good educational program like those things that we just went through, thinking about where medication fits into that, and then thinking about if those two alone are not enough, then maybe thinking about a therapy that's often more a cognitive behavioral type therapy. There are a number of medications that we use for anxiety disorders. They're called SSRIs for the most part. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It means that they take serotonin when it jumps into the synapse or the cleft and recycle it before it gets broken down and then leaves the body so it can be used longer. There was a recent study in the last month saying that SSRIs really work better than what are called SNRIs. So these, like Prozac, Luvox, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, Lexapro, seem to have much better results for anxiety than these SNRIs, which are Cymbalta and Effexor. But many good studies will also say if you've tried one or two SSRIs and they've not been effective, then it's worth trying one of these. These work more on norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So there's a wide variety of ones to consider using, and it's not usually enough to just say, I'll try one and then I'll stop. There's a wide variety of meds that can be used to treat ADHD, but for the most part, for at least the major portion of stimulants, there's two main categories, methylphenidate and dextroamphetamine. Methylphenidate is what we always thought of was just Ritalin, and there was the short-acting Ritalin. Regular Ritalin lasts about 3 to 4 hours. But now we've found ways to make that released more slowly so that it lasts longer. And meds like Concerta can last up to 12 hours, but they're still just methylphenidate. It's just coming out slower. And then there are others like Methylin and Metadate and Ritalin SR, but there is also Focalin that's related again to methylphenidate. Daytrana, which is a patch that goes on and puts on methylphenidate. Quilivant, which is a liquid that's recently had supply difficulties and isn't as available. Aptensio is another liquid preparation. And then the other category is dextroamphetamine, and those short-acting are the Dexedrine, and the longer actings are Adderall and Adderall XR, and then Vyvanse. And Adderall XR and Vyvanse last about 12 hours. But they're a different stimulant. When people talk about using stimulants, they'll say for ADHD, they're 80% effective. That's really a remarkable number to think that 80% of the time, if you have ADHD, stimulant medication will work better than placebo. But they say if you don't get a good result and you try the other class, that number goes up to 90%. So some kids do better on one than another. And it makes the case that if you're trying medications and you feel like you've only gotten a partial response to one of the others or you've had side effects that you don't like, it's worth considering trying another one and seeing where you can get the best results.
I have ADHD, my kids have ADHD. One of my kids, the one who is a little bit anxious and has dyslexia, has reported that and he takes the short-acting Adderall so that he can eat during the day. He doesn't like the way it makes him feel. It tends to exacerbate his anxiety. And I'm just curious if you concur, if that's kind of studies that have shown, and I know we're going to go meet with the doctor, and there's many other medications that we can try. So my question is that, not that I don't believe him, because that's totally.
I believe him.
Yeah, no, of course I do. And secondly, what would you recommend to kind of treat the inattention and yet not exacerbate the anxiety, for which he also takes sertraline?
So there are several strategies, and it takes, kind of gathering a history and thinking about what's been tried and what other things can be done. But Strattera is one that I didn't have up there, and Strattera works on the noradrenergic system, which is related to anxiety, and it was developed, though, to be an antidepressant, and then Lilly, who developed it, it came at about the same time SSRIs came out, and they felt we can't compete with this. But it was noted to help ADHD. They did trials. It's not thought to work quite as well as stimulants, but for some kids it works great. And there was some thought that Strattera might help dyslexia and ADHD. And the way we founded the UCSF Dyslexia Center is a guy, Steve Carnevale, who was the chair of the board at Armstrong School, came and said, we were doing a study of dyslexia, of Strattera for dyslexia and ADHD, and he came and said, why don't we start a center where we could learn more about this? And there was a small group that said maybe it works a little better. The other is sometimes Wellbutrin helps with anxiety and ADHD, and there's some people that think perhaps adding in what are called beta blockers, or alpha-adrenergic blockers like blood pressure medication that's clonidine or guanfacine that are called...
Isn't guanfacine also given for impulsivity?
It is more. It helps more with impulsivity, but it comes. The longer-acting form is Intenev. The longer-acting form of clonidine is Capve, and so sometimes people combine those two, a stimulant, along with those that help both with anxiety and with that impulsivity. So, I mean, that's a whole bunch of answers, but there are options where people can try to work, and it's not unusual for kids with anxiety and ADHD to say that stimulant medication makes them feel more anxious. And so then it's the next level of saying, okay, sometimes Folklin does that a little bit, makes that a little less so, but then there are other strategies that we just talked about putting things together to find the right combination. Sure. Yes.
My husband is and
So the question had to do what about using nicotine or the nicotine patch. The nicotine has been shown to help with ADHD, but the problem has been whether the release of it is consistent enough to get a good therapeutic effect. The same with caffeine. Caffeine helps with ADHD, but I think you all know if you take it for your attention, you never know whether 1 cup is just right or 1.5 cups is too much, and how strong was it, and does it make you come off the wall, or does it? And so for parents who say, I'm going to treat my kid's ADHD with either caffeine or a nicotine patch, they just haven't figured out a delivery system at this point that makes it so that it gets released at a slow, steady amount. So there are a number of unproven treatments, and that doesn't mean they don't work. It just means there haven't been good studies that say clearly this works. Stimulants, in a sense, have an unfair advantage because they work very dramatically, and you can see this great peak, and compared to a placebo, it separates, and it works right away. It doesn't work over weeks. It works that very day, within an hour. And so when you do a trial of a stimulant for ADHD, well, it looks positive, but if you do EEG biofeedback training, it's not like the first session is what leads to that kind of dramatic improvement. So it may be that over time, EEG biofeedback training would show a beneficial effect, but it does take some time to show that. Dietary manipulation, again, as well, is something that shows what we call small effect sizes. It doesn't go up like that. It goes up slowly across time. Megavitamin therapy, for the most part, has not been shown to be helpful, but there are people that wonder about using some herbal treatments. Manipulation doesn't seem to be helpful. Sensory integration training, maybe, but hasn't proven itself. Anti-yeast medications, some of these supplements, maybe for other things are helpful, and micronutrients, but haven't really been proven to be things that you could take in the same way that these others. But we may find particular kids that do well with some of those things because we understand better their issues. So if we think about schools and what can they do to make things better for kids, there's the social support and the role models and the connections. And I think maybe when we think about how things might have been in schools a generation ago, and kids with reading disorder and ADHD and anxiety were not fully understood or integrated into the classroom. I think we're getting much better at that. But it's clear that then a sensitive classroom for a period of time, and for some of the kids that go to some of the special schools like Sand Hill and like some of the others, there's a way that it bolsters their self-esteem, helps them start to feel better about themselves when it's been torn down. But I think more and more public schools are getting this as well and knowing how to add those things into their classroom. That they use a strength-based approach to build confidence in kids, pointing out their strengths, reinforcing them quickly, pointing out things that are going well to help them build confidence rather than being critical or negative about what they're not doing well. That it trying to reduce the stereotype threat where you hear those words that I talked about in that earlier study, you know, that said just hearing a word or reading, you know, can make a kid feel uncomfortable. Hearing a label that could be used for them is also a way that they begin to have this stereotype threat of saying then they've got the label, now that's them. Positive reframing, building resilience, what we've talked about a little bit already. And then a growth mindset, one of optimism. The future's going to look better. We're going to help things go in a good direction. Can be all things that help in the school. There are strategies that are more social, emotional, and protective, like those internal ones, the family, the peer, and the school. And then there are cognitive protective factors like oral language skills, morphologic awareness, ways that some kids have some real strengths. And what we've been doing, and I'll tell you more about in our phenotyping study, is to try and identify the kids' strengths and their weaknesses. Right now we're doing that study just at Armstrong. We're going to start doing it at Chartwell. But we've met with people here at Sand Hill and CHC to say, you know, it's about 2 days of testing. We hope we bring it down. We've had good donor support for what we're doing, and I'm not here to sell you on the program, but I am here to say that I think if we can better look at what strengths are there and how we can identify those unique ones for each kid, I think that we can make a difference in improving their outcomes rather than just shotgunning it saying that they're a reading disorder kid or they have dyslexia and that's the end, not subtyping it further so that we have literacy interventions, cognitive skills training, and supportive classrooms that can make a difference for how the kids do. So, and I think I have 1 or 2 more slides. The other is using a near-peer mentoring program that is a study, again, that Fumiko Hafe did, talking about participating in a mentoring program where kids that are a bit older that have a reading disorder work with kids that are younger and really seem to have a much better way, or at least a very effective way, of helping these kids learn to master their feelings, seeing, oh, this guy who's older or this girl has done a better job of being able to figure this out than I have been doing, and I can learn from them, and this is a good kind of thing. So increasingly, schools are starting to put more and more peer mentoring programs into schools, and Fumiko has been doing that actually throughout the whole Bay Area in trying to make those happen and work better. And that slide has been slow. Also, that points out that your self-esteem is high if you're more comfortable with your learning disability, even if you have poor emotional regulation. But if you have good emotional regulation, you may have lower discomfort with your reading disorder or your learning disorder. So both of those things, the comfort and the emotional regulation, are things that are important to be able to put together to help kids do the best they can. So I'm at the next transition point, and I'm doing pretty well on time. And I'm going to tell you just a little about our Dyslexia Center, unless there's any pressing questions from what I've done from right now. And then we'll probably have about 15 minutes to go to 8 o'clock for questions. And so our vision is to demonstrate more clearly how neuroscience research can impact education with a focus on more personalized learning. As you've heard me suggest multiple times, there's various kinds of dyslexia. There's different ways that dyslexia intertwines with ADHD and with anxiety. And if we can identify that better, we can better target the interventions that we're making. So we want to elucidate that, not by paper and pencil tests or by someone saying, oh, this person looks anxious, but by doing that along with the neurobiology and the neural circuitry that are involved in what we're doing. And that has led our team of people that have a variety of backgrounds. I'll tell you about Mary Lou Gorno-Tempini in the Phenotyping Project. She's a neurologist. She actually was not starting out working with kids, worked with people with Alzheimer's that were losing language and would find that they'd lose language in particular ways. Also that people with dyslexia would age and lose language in particular ways. Fumiko Haft is it should be an MD, PhD, I'm sorry. And then a variety of our other researchers that are working with us. But we try and do it in a translational kind of an approach, a way of saying, if we just show that something works in the laboratory, that's not enough. We have to show that what we think works in the laboratory works in the classroom. So we have our phenotyping project that then feeds into an outcome study that we are doing now at Armstrong and soon at Chartwell. And that feeds back to the phenotyping project to say, is this accurate? Is it helpful? Is it helping us go the right way? And now Fumiko is developing an app that could identify kids 2 to 4 that are showing signs that they might have difficulty developing dyslexia or reading disorders so that we can intervene early and intervene before some of that real damage that gets done between kindergarten and the 2nd grade when kids aren't learning to read but they're not understanding why.
Where does that study stand in what kind of testing?
Like how many kids have we done or?
You have for intervening at age 2 or 4. At Sand Hill School, we stopped at grade 1 because we haven't been able to identify earlier, but we can usually go down.
Well, Fumiko has been doing these throughout the Bay Area, and it looks like Andre Agassi is going to give multiple millions of dollars for this to become a nationwide thing. We don't, the bottom line isn't signed, but there has been a press release for his being able to do that. So it's been developed. It's being done by Fumiko and a guy named Adam Ghazali who does a lot of apps, is really great at gamifying things, and these apps are kind of fun. And there are things like rapid naming, a variety of other things that kids don't, and it's not language-based, it's not word-based, it's based on other things that have been associated. I wouldn't say at this point there's a definitive study, but it looks like there's enough interest that we're going to be able to do quite a bit. Well, I guess we're hopeful that with Andre Agassi's money, it's a couple of years off. But it's been he has $250 million for this. So I don't know how much he's going to give for just this, but he's raised that much for literacy. So Mary Lou is doing the phenotyping project. And as you might know, different parts of the brain are involved in reading. That's what's so terrifically challenging about it, is that it's not like, you know, if you're learning to throw a baseball, you got to do the arms and the muscles, but there's a part of the brain that's involved with doing that. But in reading, you have to be able to visualize something. You have to be able to break those sounds down. You have to be able to put all that together in a way. And it involves all these different parts of the brain. So sometimes people might have more one part than another part. And she's been studying that with MRI, but with fMRI, where she has tasks that have different parts of the brain light up when you're in a scanner, and with what's called DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, that measures the way these things connect together. And interestingly, and I'm not going to go through her subtypes, but because she's not ready to publish those yet, but these are 3 kids that are all from Armstrong School and are all there because they have dyslexia. And these are how different their testing is. So on phonology, this kid is doing just fine with phonology. this kid is not doing well at all. Phonological loop is where you link words together. Sometimes kids can say the word fine, but they read a paragraph and they don't have an idea what they've read. So linking them together, this kid is doing pretty well. This kid's doing horrible. Working memory, being able to hold something in mind for a minute. This kid's doing okay, not great, but this kid is doing miserably. Word retrieval, visual, spatial, socio-emotional, all are things that in 3 kids at the same school put there for having dyslexia are looking very different, and so do their brain scans in ways that show that we're not talking about one disorder, we're talking about multiple disorders, and yet we're often challenged to say, how can we, and especially in public schools where they're having a heck of a time even knowing what to do with dyslexia, if they're just at the point saying, okay, I got a Lindemood Bell approach and I'm going to do that. And Lindemood Bell may work great for some kids, but it may not work at all for a kid that doesn't have a phonological difficulty. So this is not meant to be an instructive thing. It was more just an illustration. But a Lindemood Bell type might do well with phonological type things, but not so well with the phonological loop. Or a Slingerland would do well with these, but not all of them. Or ADHD training more for the executive function part. And so that's what we're excited about doing. And then we're measuring outcomes to say, how are these kids doing? And we have been doing that. We've had 4 times that we've measured, and it's continuing to go on. We've enrolled 34 students, but it's a little higher than that now. It took a long time to get a good outcome measure, but parents rate outcomes, teachers rate outcomes. And then we have developed some novel measures with the teachers as well. Some standards that are used in general, some that the teachers said, this is what's most important to us. So we want to have gold standards to compare to the ones that they've made up to show that that's actually working. And they have this computer-based format that the teachers and parents use to fill out their information. These are a number of the rating scales that we use and can track how kids are doing. And then we go with the phenotype and talk to the teachers and talk about what the subtype is, and then say to them, okay, here's the phenotype. What are we going to pick as a target? What can we do as an intervention? And how are we going to measure an outcome to show that that works? And then we come back and say, have you done anything differently now that you know that? What are you going to do differently? Does the phenotype-based intervention work? And I want to leave enough time for our discussion, but we have been tracking these interventions and showing that for all of them, they're giving information, but they're all reporting different things that they're doing differently based on this. So I work 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 during writing with this particular kid now, or I use some new visual learning strategies, or I've changed my approach to one-item directions, or I give him directions ahead of time. And you can read these statements from teachers that were just given spontaneously about after thinking about this phenotype, what are they doing differently? And again, things like near point versus far point copying, breaking things into small chunks, using short verbal directions, some things that we've talked about already that would work particularly well for some kids. And these are the variety of interventions that they've tried, and most of them are using multiple kinds of interventions. And we're showing changes over time with their doing all these things. Now, it's a faulty experiment because the teachers all know what the intervention was. They know we came in, we told them the phenotype. They said, oh, this is great. I've gained new insight. Now we ask them to say, how are you doing now? And they say, oh, I'm doing a lot better. This is really good. We need a better way of showing that that makes a difference. And we do have a track my progress outcome measure that we haven't finished analyzing. We do have other measures looking at things like anxiety and ADHD that are on independent scales that we hope will show us better what's happening and showing the academic gains that they're getting as well. So that was my rush through that, but I wasn't here to sell you on our dyslexia program other than to say I think there are exciting things happening in the field. I think that there are ways that ADHD, dyslexia, anxiety, and some of the other disorders are not parallel disorders, They're intertwined disorders, and by treating them in that way and trying to tease apart how we can target it, we can make a better kind of intervention. So, first question.
It was a great talk. It makes me feel like I'm like a cave woman with very crude measures. So I mean, I'm in a charter school that is still not really embracing the concept of dyslexia yet. And it's hard for me because I have a 21-year-old who is dyslexic. And he's at the new school in New York, and he's doing pretty good. He went to Armstrong, thankfully. Yeah, he got there in the 4th grade and learned to read that year. But my question to you is that, so I feel like I understand dyslexia in, maybe not in the new way, but in the old way. So the kids that fit, that, you know, that I know, the phonological, the grapheme, and then working memory and processing, those kiddos I get. But let's say I have a kid that has pretty good phonological awareness, pretty good decoding, but has no reading comprehension and has had severe trauma, you know, maybe drugs at birth or whatever. So is what you're saying that, like, would that second student that maybe can read words, but cannot have any, doesn't have any comprehension, are they also considered dyslexic now? Or am I just getting stuck in a word? Or and do you have any ideas about how to work with those kids?
Those are really the most challenging ones, and when they come up to, they're not the largest group, at least that we've identified, but they are a significant group. And I have to say that we pull all the neurologists and all the psychiatrists together, and we can't figure the house out quite. It's we're struggling because the wiring is different, and things are just not work. Especially if they're kids that have been exposed to substances, or kids that have had a very traumatic birth, or have had head injuries, or had a variety of other things. And I think we're talking about another thing than what this is, but I think the strategy is going to help us figure it out, because it's really, really hard to treat or to figure out, because these kids just they don't do very well because nobody can quite figure it out. But that's an area that we hope once we get this better, we'll be able to do it better. Yes.
Hi. So I would like to know, so I think my daughter has huge reading issues, and I believe she has ADD. I do have ADHD, and she's very anxious, which I guess is a small package here. And so I'm trying to have her evaluated through the school district, because this is kind of like my go-to people in a way. We're in a private school right now, so but I do want it to be recorded for later. And so my question to you is, I don't know if you have worked with school districts or if you are familiar with how it works. So my question is, how easy is it to be evaluated through a school district and get a diagnosis from them? Because from my understanding, they do also diagnose for dyslexia or ADD as well, right?
And you might ask at some point some of the other parents in the room that have gone through this. I find many times it works very well. If you have a good school district, you ask for an IEP. You say, my child isn't learning. I'd like to, and here are the evidence. I'd like to have you do the testing. And often, if they'll do it, they at least believe it more than, say, if you went out and brought outside testing in. So they do it internally and they pay for it. And it's really expensive if you have to do it yourself. But other times, I think their cutoff line is different, or there's a term sometimes used, twice disabled or twice gifted. And that there, if a child is bright and is functioning within their own level, even if they're dyslexic, they won't give them treatment because they're functioning at an okay level. And then sometimes
and I think the district is kind of dragging its feet.
Yeah.
You know, they don't want to spend the money,
And
right?
they can get off the hook that way. And so then it does mean sometimes finding a private school, but that becomes expensive, and you hope that they'll reimburse some of it for you, but yeah, so it's a tough one. Over this side.
So I volunteer in the school east of 101, which is a poor school district. And when I first met the principal there, I said, well, because I'm interested in dyslexia, what do you do? What do you do to diagnose and treat dyslexia? And he said, we don't diagnose it because we can't afford to treat it.
Yeah, that the idea that some people would say we don't diagnose it, and there have been other statements like that that have come along. Especially one time, I tried to go into the youth authority and see how much of learning disability, reading disorder might be present, and they at first thought, oh, this is a wonderful idea, and then they thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have to treat this if we do this, and so they didn't. I think it is a real problem, but I think if we can make strategies about saying what are the long-term costs of this, if governments care about that, but I think it's possible.
So I wanted to ask about the phenotyping and the, we have a daughter who's at Armstrong with dyslexia. She's doing great now. We have a younger daughter who just went through the IEP process, and they basically, each kid is different, but they found that she, as far as phonological issues, she doesn't really have the issue, but she's got low working memory, very slow processing, and they're blaming it all. They're just saying it's ADD, and she can't read because she has ADD, and it's the inattentive. They both have inattentive ADHD, and so I'm just wondering, can it be just ADHD, or to me, I feel like this has got to be dyslexia. It's different than most, but they're just hanging their hat on the fact that she can do the phonetics and is saying, well, can't be dyslexia.
Well, so from the firm definition of dyslexia, it's related to phonetics, and what we're saying is there are kids that can't read, and that's that controversy in the diagnosis that people have said. And it doesn't mean that they don't read because they don't try hard enough, or it's all those other things that were said before. There is some interesting research going on in what's called sluggish cognitive tempo or slow processing speed, and that somehow being attached, working both for ADHD and working for reading disorders. And so the Shawitzes have been writing a little about that, at Yale, and there are a few others that are kind of trying to see how that's an area that kind of overlaps with ADHD and reading disorder. And so I think it's a early research, but it's growing and going in that direction.
I have a 13-year-old who has dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and attentive type anxiety and depression. She takes ADHD meds and an SSRI, and she does Barton tutoring. What's my priority?
And what thing to treat, or what med, or when?
And I feel like we're focusing our attention everywhere, and it's good. She's much better than she was 2 years ago, but is there one thing that takes priority over the others when we have that whole combination of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I would pick two priorities. That's the ADHD and the reading, and I think that's one of the subtypes that we alluded to. You could say the depression. Well, that's an issue, but you're hoping if it's maybe further downstream that maybe you can help that go better. Although if she's depressed enough that she's not motivated to do the things, then I guess it's how you would put those things in a line. And if the depression is first because she's too depressed to study and work, but if it's more that she's depressed because she's not learning and getting on with her friends, then I think it has to be I think Mary Lou, the neurologist, and I would do it differently, and we joke a lot about it, that as a psychiatrist, I always see the ADHD, and I say, let's treat that first. And I do see some kids come in that can't read, and they're having a heck of a time. They're getting ready to go to school for dyslexia. Their parents finally say, okay, I've not wanted to use medications, but I'll try it now. And we try medications, and the kid's reading. So if there is a way to say you could do it that way by getting the right medication, you sound like you've been through a lot, so I don't think it's like somebody overlooked it. So if she's had that intervention, then I think it's the matter of trying to say, can you get her to a good and a well-matched. Like I like Linda Mood Bell. They've been very the two founders were people that were, I think, really well loved, but it just doesn't work for everybody. And so then you go through, well, what other things might people be trying that doesn't work quite as well for somebody? How do I find the right thing? And there are some kids even at Armstrong that we've come up with saying, you know, this may not be the best school. Maybe you need to go someplace else. And at first the teachers didn't like to hear that, and then they'd say, all right, maybe this is another subtype. And so I think it's trying to figure out that unique way. And I'm not saying they have to come and go through our research, but I'm hoping even as we give these talks that it makes parents start thinking more and more about it and saying, all right, how can I think of what's my child's unique way of learning and how can I address it better?
You guys haven't published yet, right?
We have not published. We have a website, yeah, but I mean, that says we're for real and we're doing this, but we haven't published yet. I'm going to go over here.
You were talking about cognitive behavioral approaches to helping ADHD, and I've heard that before. Do you have a resource that would be easy just to kind of?
It's kind of executive functioning training. There is a good book on ADHD and CBT. There's another good one on OCD, but I can't remember the name of the ADHD. But if you Google gets you a lot of not so good things, but I don't know if you all ever go to PubMed, www.pubmed.gov, and put those things in, you'll begin to find more reputable kinds of programs.
I'm a 12-year-old with hyperactive ADHD, anxiety, and oppositional defiance, and she struggles most with language arts, comprehension, retention, and it's a giant struggle. Do you know of any gaming apps that make it fun to read that can help with that?
I know that this guy Adam Ghazali is developing one, and I know that there's one in trial right now for ADHD, but it's not available on the market. CogMed, kind of, but it's not. But it's controversial. But you might look at those that go off of that and see how they relate for these CogMed programs. Some people are upset that they make claims that are too extensive, but they do at least make it gaming and a little more interesting. Oh, and you know, Learning Ally has something that they're just now coming out with on a way of making reading more gamified.
When you talked about the self-esteem and emotional regulation, what do you mean by LD comfort? Do you mean like the child's comfort with their diagnosis or the fact that they have a learning?
And comfort with who they are. I think that the idea of saying that if they have a learning disorder or a reading disorder, that this stereotyped image comes up and says something about the kind of person they are, that they're defective, or it has a connotation to it that is not good. And so when these kids have a way of, often from these programs that have the older kids teaching them, start to get proud of it, you know, and then they start looking at people who have done really well in these ways, and they're proud. And I do find in some of the programs that I've seen that there is this kind of, there's great things about LD and ways that I can really learn. People have talked about perhaps people with dyslexia have a good ability to make long connections, to see things that others don't make. People with autism have a good ability to make short connections. They get so focused on these little things, and they're both strengths if you see them in those different ways. But sometimes there's a study of entrepreneurs saying that something like 40% of them had dyslexia. That dyslexia led to different ways of solving things, thinking about things. And so trying then to have kids begin to feel, you know, I don't know if it's quite a pride, but at least to feel good about them and to feel comfort in themselves about the disorder is what you're saying. Yes.
The Dyslexia Center mostly a research center? I mean, if you have a child that's already been diagnosed and you know they have dyslexia, is there any?
Yeah, we wish we're a research center, and right now it's based on almost all with what we're doing with these few schools that I mentioned. Charles Schwab has given us about $1.2 million. We've put a proposal before him to develop a large clinical program that we do in conjunction with Stanford in their learning center. He hasn't given us the rest of the money for that. We lose money. We tried for a while to do a clinic, and Mary Lou and I did it together, and
So it's the same one that's at UCSF, they're one and the same.
When you were talking about rating scales for ADHD, the implication to me at least was that parents or teachers could do ratings. You could even buy the honors ADHD rating scale. But is there any sort of regulation that requires some sort of professional to actually diagnose ADHD?
absolutely, thanks for making that point. Yeah, you can't make a diagnosis off a rating scale. Even a professional shouldn't make it from a rating scale. So it's just one item. And I often, when parents tell me, you know, the mom and dad are disagreeing about whether this is ADHD, or the teachers that brought it up and they're not so sure, then I say, why don't you just look through that and discuss it with each other and be honest and see how many of them you think. And if you think you're on the edge or it might happen, then come in for an evaluation and then let's think more carefully about it. You don't have to have a whole psychoed battery in order to diagnose ADHD either, but it is based on the rating scale, gathering a careful history, doing the DSM-5 criteria, and a skilled professional listening and thinking about what else could this be, if, you know, because there are other things in the differential too that's important. But thanks for bringing that up.
Are there tools, like the Vanderbilt or other assessments that parents might use to look at things like processing speed or memory? I mean, it's very expensive to go through all these things, and a lot of it just doesn't pay off. Are there ways we can sort of start and say, oh, no, that's not it?
I don't know if things for memory or processing speed. If you're interested in, yeah, I don't know. Those are both more cognitive tests that are done not by just a rating scale. So I don't have a good answer for you. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.